Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal that morning, the light of a gentle summer sun quietly filtered through the towering stained-glass windows of the Grand Cathedral in Port Charles, casting a warm, golden hue over the pristine white floral arrangements that adorned both sides of the aisle. Each petal seemed to glow with serene anticipation, each ribbon carefully tied to reflect grace and purity. The town was hushed in reverence, as though everyone held their breath for the promise of renewal, of love triumphing over sorrow. For Willow, this day was meant to be the end of one life and the beginning of another. After surviving the depths of illness, navigating the traumas of a fractured family, and confronting truths that nearly broke her spirit, she had finally reached the threshold of healing. She had found Drew, stable, kind, dependable. And in him, she envisioned not just a partner, but a promise, a future of shared dreams and unconditional support. To Willow, this wedding was not simply a ceremony, it was redemption. What she never imagined, however, was that beneath the veil of white roses and vows, a storm had already begun to churn, a storm small in stature but ferocious in its truth, and it was wearing the face of a little girl named Scout. In the final days leading up to the wedding, Willow had tried tirelessly to nurture her relationship with Scout, Drew's only daughter. She believed it was crucial that this bond be genuine, not simply a formality. With softness and vulnerability, Willow sat beside the young girl and shared parts of herself no one else saw, tales of surviving leukemia, moments of maternal pride over Wiley and Amelia, and her heartfelt hope to become part of a real, blended family. She painted a picture of Sunday breakfasts, laughter in the backyard, and holidays wrapped in comfort. Willow believed that her honesty would bridge the gap, that Scout would see her not as an intruder but as an ally, a new chapter rather than a replacement. Yet what Willow could not see, what perhaps no one truly could, was the silent, festering resentment within Scout, slowly growing, fed by abandonment, loss, and confusion. Scout had never truly recovered from the absence of her mother, Sam. Though no one dared say it aloud, the void Sam left behind was more than emotional, it was existential. And now, here stood Willow, sweet and sorrowful, stepping into shoes that Scout had never agreed were empty. More than that, Scout had watched Drew transform. His eyes, once clear and grounded, had grown distracted, his silences longer. She had noticed the way he pulled away during their talks, how he avoided speaking of Sam, and worst of all, how he slipped away at night for secret phone calls and quiet drives to meet with a woman whose name she never heard mentioned. Scout had followed him once. She had seen him with a stranger, laughing, sharing a drink, far from the image of the grieving, devoted man he portrayed at home. And in that moment, something inside her hardened. She no longer trusted her father's love. She certainly didn't trust Willow's. The night before the wedding, Willow tried once more. She and Scout sat together in the soft glow of lamplight, and Willow gently asked how the girl felt about the ceremony. Scout nodded, said all the right things, offered polite smiles that didn't reach her eyes. Willow left the conversation relieved, thinking perhaps she had reached her. But beneath that innocent facade, Scout's mind was a storm. She knew that if she said nothing, she would be complicit. And so she made a decision, a terrible, brave, and irreversible decision to speak the truth where no one expected it. The next day, the cathedral was filled with an expectant hush. Guests arrived in elegant attire, music swelled softly, and Drew stood at the altar with nervous pride. Willow entered like a vision of grace, her dress floating like mist behind her, eyes brimming with love and hope. The priest raised his hands to bless the union, beginning the sacred words of promise. Drew reached for Willow's hand. And then, like a needle scratching across the surface of a delicate song, Scout stepped into the aisle. She did not cry. She did not tremble. She stood, small, composed, and terribly still, at the center of the sanctified space. Every head turned. The music faltered. For a few eternal seconds, it was as if time forgot to move. Then, Scout spoke. Her voice, clear and resonant, sliced through the air. She declared that she hated Willow, that she refused to accept her as a mother. Her words fell like thunder on the polished marble floors. She accused Drew of betraying Sam, of lying to everyone in that room, and most of all, to her. She revealed that she had heard his secrets, that she had seen his deceptions, and she believed this marriage was not about love, it was about guilt, about hiding, about starting over without ever making amends. She turned to Willow, her voice steady and full of rage, and said, "You're not my mother. You never were. You never even tried to love me. You loved the idea of family, but I was never part of your dream." The silence that followed was suffocating. Drew was frozen, eyes wide, mouth agape. Willow's complexion faded from radiant ivory to a ghostly pale. The guests fidgeted in their seats, a wave of discomfort rippling through them. Carly's knuckles whitened as she clenched Michael's hand. Nina wiped away a tear that slipped despite herself. The priest lowered his book. No one moved. And then, chaos. Drew rushed toward Scout, reaching out to silence her or perhaps just to hold her, but the girl pulled away violently and fled down the aisle. Reporters outside, catching wind of the disruption, surged toward the doors. Willow moved to follow Scout, desperate to explain, to protect, but Jason stepped in, gently stopping her. He had anticipated this possibility, had known Scout was holding something back, and now it was too late. The image of that child, alone, angry, walking away from the wreckage of a broken fairy tale, burned into everyone's memory. The wedding was over. Not postponed. Not quietly rescheduled. Destroyed. As the guests began to file out, murmuring and avoiding each other's eyes, Drew stood alone at the altar, shattered. Willow, abandoned and stunned, was escorted out the side door. The rose petals scattered down the aisle felt almost mocking, as if beauty itself had been betrayed. But even as the church emptied and the rumors began to spread through the streets of Port Charles, one truth remained crystal clear: Scout had done what no one else had the courage to do. She told the truth. And the truth burned everything down. The unraveling of Willow and Drew's wedding had been swift and brutal, but the true devastation came in the echo. The silent days that followed, when the glittering illusions Willow had clung to were stripped away, leaving only the raw, jagged truth behind. The wedding was supposed to mark a new beginning, a clean break from a past scarred by illness, abandonment, and uncertainty. It was supposed to be the moment she stepped into stability, into love, into the security of a man who claimed he would never leave. Instead, it became a funeral procession for everything she had believed in. And the one who had delivered the eulogy was not an enemy or a stranger, but a child, Scout, whose courage had cracked open the truth with more force than any adult ever dared. Scout's accusations had seemed unthinkable in the moment, shocking, yes, but surely the product of pain, confusion, maybe even adolescent rebellion. But Willow, unable to silence the doubts planted in her heart, agreed to review the contents of Scout's forgotten phone when Jason handed it to her the following morning. What began as a hesitant curiosity quickly descended into horror. The messages were detailed. Clear. Chronological. Scout had documented everything. Recordings of Drew's phone conversations revealed a side of him Willow had never encountered: cold, calculated, and deeply strategic. In one clip, Drew spoke with a public relations manager, discussing the importance of leveraging Willow's story. He outlined how the public's empathy toward a young mother surviving leukemia could be a compelling backdrop for launching their next nonprofit campaign. The words made Willow's skin crawl. Another file featured a conversation with an anonymous donor, where Drew promised exclusivity in exchange for a large donation, using her name and her condition as the bargaining chip. And then came the photographs. Not just of Drew at charity galas or fundraising dinners, but of clandestine meetings with unfamiliar women, captured outside low-lit restaurants and boutique hotels far from Port Charles. Scout had followed him more than once, driven not by spite but by instinct. Something in her had known that what was being sold to the world was a lie. The timestamps on the photos aligned with nights Drew claimed to be working late or handling logistics. Each revelation sliced deeper than the last, until Willow was left numb, shaking, her eyes stinging not with tears but with disbelief. How had she not seen it? How had she, so in tune with others' emotions, so sensitive to dishonesty, allowed herself to be played like a tragic centerpiece in someone else's performance? The depth of the betrayal was not just romantic, it was existential. Drew had not merely failed her as a partner. He had used her as a symbol, turned her survival into currency, and pawned her vulnerability for public applause. And perhaps worst of all, he had done it all while smiling at her like a savior. The fallout was immediate. Word of the wedding debacle had already spread like wildfire through Port Charles, but the emergence of these truths, whispers first, then headlines, turned scandal into scandalous justice. Drew became a pariah almost overnight. His name, once synonymous with charitable outreach and civic involvement, was now blacklisted from the very organizations he helped fund. Friends turned cold, associates distanced themselves, and even those who once idolized him now viewed him with suspicion. He fled the city in shame, slipping away in the middle of the night with no formal goodbye, leaving behind a string of unanswered questions and a woman who no longer recognized the man she had nearly married. Willow, devastated but resolute, made a choice: she would not hide. Instead, she returned to the hospital, not as a patient, but as a volunteer. She threw herself into work at the children's oncology ward, where she could hold the hands of children who fought battles like she once had, where her pain could be alchemized into compassion, not pity. She spent her days reading stories, playing games, soothing terrified parents, and offering quiet presence. She didn't speak of Drew. She didn't speak of the wedding. She didn't need to. Everyone knew. Her silence said more than words ever could. In the evenings, she wandered the quiet halls after visiting hours, tracing her steps through memories that now felt distant and dreamlike. She no longer wore her engagement ring. She no longer looked at bridal magazines or browsed nursery furniture for the children she and Drew once discussed raising together. Those dreams had turned to ash, and she walked through them barefoot, each step a painful lesson in resilience. And yet, even amid the ashes, there was one lingering ember: Scout. After the wedding, the young girl vanished. She missed school. Didn't answer calls. Even Jason struggled to track her movements. It was as if Scout had disappeared into the very shadows that had haunted her. When she was finally found, curled up in a lakeside cabin Sam had once taken her to, she didn't resist. She didn't speak. She merely allowed Jason to carry her home like a ghost returning to its abandoned shell. For days, she remained silent. She avoided Drew's name. She refused to explain why she had done what she did. But she didn't need to. The world now understood. She had done what no one else dared. She had spoken the truth in a room full of lies. And even if it shattered everything, she had protected her heart, and maybe even Willow's, from further harm. When Scout and Willow crossed paths weeks later in the hallway of General Hospital, it wasn't dramatic. There were no tears, no accusations, no pleas for forgiveness. Just a look. A long, piercing look that passed between them like a current, filled with history, pain, recognition. It was the gaze of a child who had lost too much too soon, and a woman who had discovered that sometimes, the truth comes not from those who promise to love you, but from those brave enough to break you free. Scout's eyes, once full of fire, now held a quiet sorrow. Not regret, not hatred, but a weary kind of wisdom. And Willow, looking back at her, felt the weight of everything they had endured, forged not in tenderness, but in a brutal honesty that neither of them had wanted, but both of them needed. It wasn't closure. It wasn't peace. But it was real. And in a world that had offered Willow nothing but illusions, that was enough. Port Charles moved on, as it always did, with gossip giving way to the next scandal, the next affair, the next surprise twist. But in the quiet corners of the city, between the hospital walls and the still waters of the lake cabin, two souls carried a truth no one else fully understood. A woman who had been used, and a child who had seen too much. Bound not by love, but by clarity. And perhaps, in the end, that clarity would be their salvation. Not the wedding that never was. Not the promises that were broken. But the unflinching, painful truth that had burned it all down and made room for something better to rise from the ruin. The story that many in Port Charles believed had concluded with a ruined wedding and a broken heart was, in truth, only just beginning. What unfolded that day in the church was not an ending, but a detonation, a rupture in the emotional core of the community that would echo long after the guests had gone home and the flowers had withered. The ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of endurance, a testament to love that had withstood illness, grief, and public scrutiny. Instead, it became a reckoning, peeling back layers of deception, self-delusion, and carefully maintained illusions. And at the epicenter of that reckoning stood two figures, Willow, the woman who thought she had finally found peace, and Scout, the child who shattered that illusion with a voice filled not with malice, but with undeniable truth. In the quiet aftermath, as news of the incident spread throughout Port Charles, reactions ranged from disbelief to vindication. For some, it was confirmation of suspicions long buried, whispers about Drew's convenient timing, the way he seemed too polished, too perfect, too rehearsed. For others, it was a shock, a fall from grace that felt personal. Drew had cultivated an image of reliability, integrity, and devotion. He was the man who had returned from captivity, the man who helped rebuild. How could he, of all people, have manipulated someone like Willow? But as more pieces of the puzzle emerged, phone logs, financial records, covert meetings, it became clear that the man everyone thought they knew had been playing a long, quiet game. And Willow? She was merely the centerpiece of his strategy. The weight of that realization nearly crushed her. In the days following the wedding, Willow withdrew from public view, retreating not out of shame, but from the need to breathe in a world that had so violently turned upside down. Her home, once filled with wedding plans, flower samples, and dreams of a shared life, became a tomb of memories. The dress still hung in her closet. The bouquet, now wilted, remained on her kitchen table like an accusation. She avoided mirrors. Avoided phone calls. She deleted the wedding playlist she and Drew had created together. But no matter how many artifacts she tried to erase, the truth remained, etched into her bones. The most devastating question haunted her every moment: had she ever really known the man she almost married? And then, beyond the betrayal, beyond the humiliation, came something even more difficult to face: self-doubt. Not just about Drew, but about herself. How had she missed it? How had she allowed herself to be drawn so deeply into a fantasy? Was she so desperate for stability, for the idea of love, that she ignored the warning signs? She replayed conversations in her mind, moments that once felt romantic now tinged with manipulation. She remembered how Drew would say, "You make me look good," or, "The world needs to see how strong you are," and how, at the time, those words felt empowering. Now, they felt like branding. But amid that chaos, amid the crumbling of everything she thought was real, there was one small flicker of clarity, and it came in the form of Scout. At first, Willow couldn't bear to think of the girl. The memory of her voice slicing through the silence of the cathedral, the rawness of her declarations, had felt like a betrayal. Willow had believed they were building something, a fragile, tender connection, one conversation at a time. But now she understood. Scout's words had not been meant to wound her. They had been a lifeline. A brutal, honest cry from someone who had seen the cracks long before anyone else. Someone who refused to let the grown-ups pretend any longer. And in that understanding, Willow began to see Scout not as a saboteur, but as the only person who had loved her enough to tell her the truth. Because while everyone else around her had played their roles, smiling, toasting, pretending, the only one who dared to stop the performance was a child who had already lost too much. Scout had no political motivation. No interest in public perception. What she had was grief, instinct, and a fierce loyalty to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. In the sterile quiet of General Hospital's pediatric ward, where Willow had returned as a volunteer to find purpose in the wake of her heartbreak, she began to make sense of it all. She folded blankets. She read to sick children. She held the hands of terrified parents. And she started to rebuild, not the life she had planned with Drew, but the one she could create on her own. Slowly, quietly, she reclaimed her identity. Not as a bride, not as a symbol, but as a woman who had survived being used and who now chose to give without strings. Then, one afternoon, as she exited the elevator on the hospital's second floor, Willow saw her. Scout stood alone near the nurse's station, her posture tense, her eyes flicking toward the hallway as if contemplating escape. For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway fell silent, the background noise of monitors and footsteps fading into nothing. And in that stillness, they looked at each other, not as stepmother and stepdaughter, not as adversaries or casualties of Drew's betrayal, but as survivors. Scout's gaze no longer held the fire of protest or the weight of accusation. Instead, it carried something far more complicated: sorrow, resilience, and perhaps, a question. A question about whether Willow had hurt her. Whether Willow had truly seen what she risked to stop that wedding. Whether the truth, painful as it was, had been worth it. And Willow, swallowing the lump in her throat, nodded, not with words, but with her eyes, her breath, her stillness. She did understand now. More than ever. Because the love that Scout had shown was not born of hugs and compliments. It had been forged in fire. It had been the kind of love that chooses truth over comfort, that risks rejection to save someone from illusion. It was the kind of love few ever have the courage to give, especially when it means standing alone in a room full of people and saying, "This is wrong."